Hi everybody, it's Tom Woods, and today we're going to talk about the cathedrals. The medieval cathedrals have been referred to by a recent art historian as the greatest achievements in the entire theater of art. Well, those are quite astonishing words, and we're going to examine those cathedrals right now. I'm going to say a little bit about Gothic architecture because that's the architectural style we associate with, I think, the most impressive of the cathedrals, the ones that people tend to want to visit. This is not a course in art history, so we're not going to get into a lot of technical detail on this, although I'm very interested in this subject, and I could talk about it for quite some time. But we're just going to focus on just enough so that you can get out of this Western Civ course feeling like you know enough about the cathedrals that you can call yourself a well-educated person. Now, the first thing I want you to know is the way a medieval church tended to be built, and this would be true both of churches in the Romanesque and the Gothic architectural traditions. So what you have on the screen here is a diagram that labels three parts of the church. You've got the apse, the transept, and the nave. Now you'll notice that the way this church is built, it looks like a cross, with the transept going right across it. That's not a coincidence, of course, because the cross imagery is obviously central to Christianity, hence the transept. The nave is going to be where the people will be seated, right toward the entrance, and then on the east side you'll have the apse. The apse will be where the altar will be, where any time in a building there's an apse, that's where something important or dramatic takes place. So that's the general layout that we're talking about here. And when we talk about the cathedrals, in this course we're going to be focused primarily on the Gothic cathedrals, which really flourish in the 1200s, but they're preceded by the Romanesque style. And the problem with talking about the Romanesque style in a course like this, where we have to go at breakneck speed, is that there really is no Romanesque style in the same way that there's a Gothic style. That is to say, the Romanesque tradition is very diverse. You'll find all different kinds of buildings that look very different from each other, and yet they all belong to the Romanesque tradition. So it's harder to identify those, to pin them down, than it is to pin down a Gothic cathedral, which you can more or less recognize as soon as you see it. The Romanesque cathedrals, the style that preceded the Gothic that we're going to look at today, had all different influences. They were influenced by the tradition of Rome, by the tradition of Byzantium, as well as by Islam. This is a church in the Romanesque style, actually from Poland. And as I say, if we were to go through, we could go through slide after slide after slide of Romanesque buildings, Romanesque churches, and you can do that by using Google Images. Just type Romanesque churches or Romanesque cathedrals, and you'll see what I mean. They're all different styles. But one thing that you'll notice is that they tend to have very thick walls, and the space for windows tends to be limited. And the reason for that is that people designing Romanesque structures were increasingly interested in moving away from the use of wood for the ceilings because, well, among other things, because of the risk of fire. And so they began using stone in the ceilings. The problem with this is that when you're building a big structure with a lot of open space in it, and then you're putting a whole lot of stone at the top, that's going to put a lot of pressure downward on the building. And so you're going to need very thick walls and buttresses to be able to support the building, to support these stone ceilings. And that was the issue faced by the Romanesque designers. So you're going to have relatively little space for windows because you really need to use as much of that space as you can for supporting walls, to support these very heavy ceilings. And these are going to be some of the problems that the Gothic tradition of architecture in cathedral design is going to solve. Now, in the Gothic cathedrals, we're going to note a couple of features that have theological significance. That is to say, these features of the Gothic cathedral that we'll see many slides of coming up in just a minute, don't worry, but there are a couple of features of them that are going to be notable not just for their architectural significance, but also because they reflect something about God as people in the church thought of him, as people in the Catholic Christian tradition thought of God. There are going to be features of these cathedrals that reflect their understanding of God. And the first of these is the incredible geometric coherence of the Gothic cathedrals, the incredible order, mathematical order that runs throughout. And let me share with you, if I may, a passage of my own, from one of my own books, in which I talk about this subject. And my passage here runs as follows. At the time that Gothic architecture was evolving from its Romanesque predecessor, more and more Catholic thinkers were becoming persuaded of the link between mathematics, geometry in particular, and God. Ever since Pythagoras and Plato, an important strain of thought within Western civilization had identified mathematics with the divine. At Chartres, the famous cathedral school, scholars, and here I'm quoting historian Robert Scott, believed that geometry was a means for linking human beings to God, that mathematics was a vehicle for revealing to mankind the innermost secrets of heaven. They thought the harmony of musical consonants was based on the same ratios as those forming cosmic order, that the cosmos was a work of architecture and God was its architect. These ideas led builders to conceive of architecture as applied geometry, geometry as applied theology, and the designer of a Gothic cathedral as an imitator of the divine master. Just as the great geometer, that is God, created the world in order and harmony, explains Professor John Baldwin, so the Gothic architect, in his small way, attempted to fashion God's earthly abode according to the supreme principles of proportion and beauty. And then I go on here, the reference to Salisbury Cathedral is one that we'll see in the slides. The geometric proportionality that can be found in these cathedrals is quite striking. Consider England's Salisbury Cathedral. Measuring the cathedral's central crossing, where its principal transept intersects the east-west axis, we find it to be 39 feet by 39 feet. This primary dimension, in turn, is the basis for nearly all of the cathedral's remaining dimensions. And then I talk about the bays inside the cathedral. The bay is the space between two columns. So you got a lot of columns in the cathedral. Space between any of those two columns is called a bay. So, for example, both the length and the width of each of the nave's 10 bays is 19 feet 6 inches, exactly half of the length of the central crossing, 39 feet. The nave itself consists of 20 identical spaces measuring 19 feet 6 inches square, and another 10 spaces measuring 19 feet 6 inches by 39 feet. Other aspects of the structure offer still more examples of an overall geometric coherence permeating the cathedral. This attention to geometric proportion is evident throughout the Gothic tradition. Another striking example is the Cathedral of Saint-Remy in Reims. Although Saint-Remy, which still contains elements of the earlier Romanesque style, is not the purest example of a Gothic structure, it already exhibits the attention to geometry and mathematics that would constitute such an arresting quality of this tradition. The influence of St. Augustine and his belief in the symbolism of numbers, as well as his conviction that God had ordered all things according to measure, number, and weight, is immediately evident. The choir at Saint-Remy is among the most perfect Trinitarian symbols in Gothic architecture. For the play on the number 3, because remember, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, that God is 3, while also being 1. The play on the number 3 encompasses the triple windows lighting each of the 3 levels of the main apse, and even the number obtained by multiplying the number of bays in the choir elevations, 11, by the number of stories, is 33, and 33 is the age that Christ reached while on earth. Again, this desire for geometric precision and numerical meaning, which contributes significantly to the pleasure that people derive from these great edifices, is no mere coincidence. It derives from theological ideas traceable to the Church Fathers. St. Augustine, whose work De Musica would become the most influential aesthetic treatise of the Middle Ages, considered architecture and music the noblest of the arts, since their mathematical proportions were those of the universe itself, and they therefore elevated our minds to the contemplation of the divine order. So geometric coherence is one aspect of these structures. Another one is light. There is a tremendous amount of light flowing in through the large windows in the Gothic tradition. As we're going to see in a moment, the Gothic tradition solves this problem of the heavy structure and the large, thick walls necessary to support the whole structure. It's going to solve that problem. It's going to need much thinner walls. It's going to leave a lot more availability for windows because you don't need the walls alone as the support structures of a Gothic cathedral. So that frees up a lot more space within the walls for windows. So light becomes another aspect of this, and the light is also a theological issue. The light is also a reflection of theological understanding. It's not just an architectural principle that Gothic cathedrals just happen to have a lot more light flowing into them. There's also a theological dimension. That is, there's a dimension of this that reflects their understanding of God, that they believe that God is the light of the world, that God illuminates the mind. So the very language that's used to talk about God is permeated with the idea of light. So again, I'm going to read from my own book here. The windows of the Gothic cathedral and the emphasis on light as it flooded these enormous and majestic buildings are perhaps its most salient characteristic. It makes sense, then, that the architect would have appreciated the theological significance of light. St. Augustine had conceived of human beings' acquisition of knowledge in terms of divine illumination. God enlightens light. God enlightens the mind with knowledge. This idea of God pouring light into the minds of men proved a potent metaphor for architects in the Gothic tradition, in which physical light was meant to evoke thoughts of its divine source. We first see a great church in the Gothic style in the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, 7 miles north of Paris. I'll be showing you slides of that in a moment. Here, the religious significance of the light pouring in through the windows in the choir and the nave cannot be missed. An inscription on the doors explained that the light elevated the mind upward from the material world and directed it toward the true light that was Christ. A modern student of the subject writes as follows: as the worshipper's eyes rose toward heaven, God's grace in the form of sunlight was imagined to stream down in benediction, encouraging exaltation. Sinners could be led to repent and strive for perfection by envisioning the world of spiritual perfection where God resided, a world suggested by the geometric regularity of cathedrals. So, how are they going to solve this problem? How are they going to be able to make large cathedrals and yet not have them collapse from all the weight? How are they going to do this? And these are tremendous structures, as you'll see in a minute, these Gothic cathedrals. And the answer involves the introduction of something called the flying buttress. And I'll show you in one of the pictures what a flying buttress looks like. I have a diagram of it on an upcoming slide. But the idea is that you're going to draw the weight laterally away from the structure. Now, laterally means through, in effect, horizontally, off to the side. So instead of having a structure with a lot of thick walls to hold the thing up, and so it's thick, and you don't have room for windows because you need all that space for the heavy walls, that's going to lead to a very dark interior of your building. Well, instead what's going to happen is a lot of this weight, a lot of the burden of carrying all that weight is going to be thrust out off to the side of the building. So you won't have to have all these big buttresses inside the building. You'll have what's called flying buttresses that are going to transfer the weight to structures on the outside of the building. So you've got this force pushing down on the walls of the cathedral because of all the heavy materials that are used, heavy building materials. The flying buttresses are going to redirect this weight off the supporting walls. And so now the cathedrals can have more window openings, so you're going to get more light flowing in. Buildings can have thinner walls, so you'll need less building material. And you don't have to have so many support structures in the building. A lot of the support structures then can be transferred outside the building. So here's what we're talking about with a flying buttress. I'll see if I can do this with the cursor here. This right here is a flying buttress. So here we've got a structure on the outside helping to buttress the building. And here's the flying buttress that's transferring this downward pressure out to here. Likewise, this is a flying buttress as well. Then back here, this is also a flying buttress. This is also a flying buttress. Here's another diagram. You can see, again, the flying buttresses. You can see the buttress itself outside the structure. Instead of inside, it's outside now. And we're helping to thrust the weight outward with the help of the flying buttresses. And then here we've talked about the nave. And then there are other aspects that we won't get into here. But if you're interested in this, you would need to really understand Gothic cathedrals. You've got to understand the vault and the ribbed vault in particular, as opposed to other styles of vaulting. Now, there are great examples of Gothic cathedrals that we'll look at. The first that we'll see on the upcoming slides is the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis, which I referred to briefly in the past, or before. Here's the outside of it. Here's the inside. We can see quite a bit of light flowing in. Here we have a glimpse upward at some of the stained glass work, which is also going to be a characteristic feature of these cathedrals. This is the Cathedral of Notre Dame at Paris, although my wife hates when I say that. I should call it Notre Dame, she says, so there you have it. Now, on this side of the cathedral in Paris here, you can see the flying buttresses now, no longer just on a diagram, but here you can see, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one. So you see there's a tremendous amount of supporting structure on the outside of the cathedral. So you have less need on the inside for all this clutter, although of course I think it's quite lovely to look at. But all the same, on the inside you want to be, the purpose of the cathedral is to focus your mind on divine things, not on these architectural necessities. Here's a bird's eye view, not quite a bird's eye view, but a view from the sky of Chartres Cathedral. You can see what an astonishing achievement this is. This is one of the major achievements of the High Middle Ages. Scholastic philosophy would be one, the cathedrals would be one, the Divine Comedy of Dante, which we'll talk about in the future, would be one, and certainly these cathedrals are one. We also find at Chartres and at other cathedrals on the facade and throughout the structure, there's a lot of sculpture going on as well. Not freestanding sculpture, it's built into the building. These are not going to be statues that you can walk all the way around. You can't circumnavigate these statues the way you could in ancient Greece and Rome, for example, when we saw a lot of their freestanding sculpture. These sculptures are going to be built into the side of the building, and you can also find them throughout the structure. What we're seeing here, I'll just show you what we've got from left to right. These are 5 of the apostles, and we've got here the apostle Matthew, and you can't quite see from this angle, but this is actually like a little guy, like a scowling little guy. This is an evil pagan that Matthew is standing over. This is the apostle Philip. This is the apostle Thomas. They are both carrying swords. You may not be able to tell that those are swords, but that's what they are. These are symbols of their martyrdom, and they're standing over the pagan rulers who were responsible for their deaths. Then we have here the Apostle Andrew. Andrew is holding a martyr's cross, indicating his martyrdom. Likewise, the Apostle Peter, who was crucified, is carrying a martyr's cross. And also the dead giveaway that this is the Apostle Peter is, what's he holding in his other hand? This is a key. He's holding the keys. And so the keys are, of course, the symbol associated with Peter because of the Matthew 16:18 reference that was used as the foundation of the papacy. Here's a sample of the stained glass that you'll see. This is depicting Christ relating the parable of the Good Samaritan to a couple of Pharisees. This may be my favorite of the cathedrals. This one is in England. This is Salisbury Cathedral. And again, you just look at it, and it is such a stunning achievement. We talked earlier in this lesson about the incredible geometric coherence overall at Salisbury. Here's a glimpse inside and a glimpse upward. I think I went too fast there. Let's go back and can look inside again briefly. And then gazing upward a bit. I also want to make reference to the work of a scholar named Erwin Panofsky. He wrote a book in 1951 called Gothic Architecture and Scholasticism. And he drew parallels between the cathedrals, some of which we've looked at today, and the Summae of the scholastic philosophers. Because, of course, St. Thomas Aquinas writes the Summa Theologica, and people are writing these works in which they're trying to take all this different learning and all these different views and produce a single coherent edifice out of it all, a single coherent whole. And Panofsky is going to say, well, in effect, they're doing in philosophy what the Gothic architects are doing in architecture. They're both building these incredibly creative structures, every bit building on what came before, taking a whole lot of things and building something coherent out of it. So in the same way that a scholastic treatise will take opposing views and try to reconcile them together in a synthesis, well, the Gothic architect is going to do the same thing. Gothic architecture synthesizes preceding traditions instead of just adopting one and suppressing the other. Also, scholastics, as I indicated, were system builders. They're not just answering this question or that question. They want to build a whole system of thought, a whole system of understanding. Well, likewise, the cathedrals created overall coherence and order out of all their individual components. So that's a brief overview of the cathedrals, one of the great achievements of the High Middle Ages. Thanks for watching.